Yo guys, this is Luke, and this is the TCL 10 Pro. Now, typically I would structure these reviews in more of a narrative style, but for this video, I want to do something a little bit different. I want to first highlight what the phone does well and then what it does okay. First and foremost, we have to talk about the display. Now, coming from a display manufacturer, you would expect a good quality display. And while this wasn't necessarily the case with the 10L, on the 10 Pro, it definitely is. The 10 Pro ships with a 6.47 edge-to-edge 1080p AMOLED display that features an admittedly slightly older teardrop notch design, but it's not too bad. The screen is big, the pixel density is great, and the overall display just looks good. The Pro also ships with TCL's NXT Vision, which on this display works a bit better than it did on the 10 Pro. So if you're watching HDR content in Netflix or YouTube, colors are definitely going to be more accurate with this setting on. However, for the most part, I still left it off. So on to the next good thing about this phone is going to be the battery life. So the 10 Pro ships with a 4500 mAh battery, which makes it really easy to get through a full day. Now on average, I was getting about 7 to 8 hours of screen on time depending on the usage, and this phone also ships with an 18-watt fast charger and takes about 35 minutes to hit 50% and 2 hours to fully charge. Lastly, the design of this phone is great. For $450, this phone feels and handles like a far more expensive phone. It's got a nice weight in the hands, the camera is flush with the back of the phone, and it's got aluminum sides with a nice glass curved screen on the front. Honestly, the phone just looks and feels like a flagship phone, and I had several people assume it was a newer Samsung device just by the way it looked. Now, another thing to note is that the 10 Pro also ships with an IR blaster and a headphone jack, something that is very reminiscent of older flagships such as the Note 9, and it's still definitely appreciated here. Now on the side, you get another hardware button for pulling up the Google Assistant, but this can also be mapped to other apps, and I found myself not accidentally pressing it as much as I did on the 10L. Now the phone also charges via USB-C, and unfortunately we only get one mono speaker here, but the speaker is better here than on the 10L. So all of these things sound pretty good, however this is where we start to shift into the okay category. Starting off with performance, the 10 Pro does get an upgrade from the 10L in the form of a Qualcomm 675, and you can definitely feel it. There's little to no lag, menus are responsive, and the overall UI feels really smooth. Occasionally the device will start to stutter under really heavy loads, but it's nothing that can't be fixed with closing a couple of apps. Now the Pro is running TCL UI, which is based on Android 10, with a promise for an update to Android 11, and overall it's not terrible. There's little bloat, and while I would like to see a more stock experience on the phone, it's not bad at all. Now in terms of gaming, the 10 Pro ships with an Arduino 612 and a 6GB of RAM, which isn't terrible by any means, but just keep in mind that you won't be able to play heavier titles smoothly on this phone. And one last thing to note, the 10 Pro ships with an in-display fingerprint sensor. However, I didn't really have the best success with it, as I can only really get it to work about 80% of the time. When it does work, it's pretty fast, but the unreliability kinda killed it for me. Lastly, let's talk about probably the biggest average thing about this phone, which is going to be the cameras. So in my 10L review, I wasn't really impressed with the performance of the camera. While it wasn't necessarily bad, it didn't really do anything that amazing, and unfortunately that kind of rings true here as well, but with a couple of major differences. The 10 Pro features a 64 megapixel main shooter, a 16 megapixel ultra wide, 5 megapixel macro, and a 2 megapixel depth sensor. And while these might seem like pretty solid numbers, they don't necessarily ring true in real world testing. Right off the bat, the 10 Pro has decent dynamic range, but tends to overexpose everything. In almost every shot, the camera pushes the highlights and lifts the shadows a bit too much. Now thankfully most of this can be corrected in post, but for the average user, it's a little bit annoying. Thankfully the contrast, color, and detail all seem to be here, but unfortunately the 10 Pro tends to over-sharpen images, which can make for some really unnatural photos. Now as you move towards the ultra-wide, detail starts to significantly decrease, especially in lower light scenarios, which makes the ultra-wide probably not the best option. Lastly, video seems to be alright, there's nothing particularly special here, and while the 10 Pro can shoot in 4K 30 frames per second with decent stabilization, we start to run into the overexpose, oversaturation issues as before. Now, the 24 megapixel selfie camera isn't half bad, but again, we still seem to struggle with the general camera issues that I mentioned earlier. Overall, the performance of the camera is generally okay, especially for social media. However, at this price point, you could easily save $100 and go for something like the Pixel 4a, which has an amazing camera for the price. So at the end of the day, the 10 Pro seems to be a very promising device. For TCL's first attempt at a more flagship device, it's not bad. The design and screen are definitely there, but TCL definitely needs to up the performance in the camera. For $450, I can see why this phone would be appealing for some. However, when you start to consider the other options at this price point, i.e. the iPhone SE and the Pixel 4a, then it really becomes a bit harder to recommend this phone, as both of those other devices nail it when it comes to price for performance and camera quality. Alright, so all in all, if you are looking for a good Android experience and the best camera quality and performance are not an absolute must for you, then the 10 Pro is actually a pretty good option. I'm really excited to see what the next generation of TCL phones look like, as the 10 Pro and L seem to be pretty decent launching points. Well, that's going to wrap it up for this video. Big shout out to TCL for sending this device over. If you liked this video, you know what to do. If you didn't, well, I guess that's okay, but do let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. And as always, until next time, peace.